Aloha. My name is David Louie, and today it's my absolute privilege to host a conversation with two prominent attorneys and icons of the civil rights movement in the United States. These two gentlemen, Bill Baxley and Doug Jones, are from Alabama, and they have been foremost in the fight for social justice and racial equality in the United States. Today, we're going to talk about their roles in the prosecution of 3 of the 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan who perpetrated the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, which was one of the most heinous crimes of the century. Hello, Bill. Hello, Doug.
David.
Hey, David.
Thank you so much for being with me today. Let me, for our audience, we're going to talk a little bit about the background here of both of these gentlemen, and then we're going to talk about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and then we're going to talk about their roles in the prosecutions. So first off, Bill Baxley. Bill Baxley hails from Alabama. He served as a district attorney there. And served 2 terms as the Attorney General of the state of Alabama from 1971 to 1979. At the time, he was the youngest person ever in the United States to hold a state Attorney General position. He successfully prosecuted Robert Chambliss, one of the bombers who perpetrated this crime, and he initiated this shortly after he became the Attorney General in 1971. Since that time, as the Attorney General, Bill became the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Alabama. He ran for governor unsuccessfully, but then he opened up his law practice in 1979 and has successfully worked as one of the leading attorneys in Alabama. On a personal note, I'll note that in May of last year, Bill's son, Richard, married my daughter, Jenna. And quite frankly, I think it may be the first time that children of state AGs got married in an effort to form a more perfect union. So welcome, Bill.
Thanks.
All right. And Doug Jones needs no introduction. Doug served as the U.S. Senator from Alabama from 2018 to 2021. He was the first Democratic senator from Alabama for a long time. And before he became a U.S. Senator, Doug went to law school, worked after graduating from law school for legendary Senator Howard Heflin. And Doug worked on the Judiciary Committee as a staffer for Senator Heflin. And then he was appointed as an assistant U.S. attorney in Alabama from 1980 to 1984 and was appointed to be the U.S. attorney by President Clinton in 1997. After becoming the U.S. attorney, Doug reopened the cold case prosecution of the perpetrators of this bombing and prosecuted Thomas Blanton Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry, 2 of the other KKK Klansmen who perpetrated this. Doug wrote a book about it. You can see it right there on his bookshelf, Bending Towards Justice, the Birmingham church bombing that changed the course of civil rights. And since that time, Doug has been active as both a politician, an attorney, and an activist in bringing forward social justice themes and social justice matters in the nation. Both of these gentlemen are leading icons in the civil rights movement. Let me talk very briefly right now about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that occurred in 1963, because this was one of the seminal moments in the civil rights movement in the United States. In the years leading up to this event, Birmingham was ground zero for segregation and the fight for integration and the fight for social justice in the South. Birmingham was a tense, violent, racially segregated city that Martin Luther King once described as being the most segregated city ever in the United States. And it had its share of bombings that had been perpetrated by various people from the KKK, and it had a nickname of Bombingham. So civil rights leaders fought against this segregation, and one of the places that they gathered and one of the places they used as a rallying point was the 16th Street Baptist Church in the heart of Birmingham. That church was a gathering place for civil rights activists, civil rights activities, civil rights marches, and civil rights demonstrations. In May 2 of 1963, a few months before this event, that church was the gathering place for a demonstration and marches. 1,000 students gathered and marched, and they were arrested. 600 people were arrested. They filled the jails. But following that, because of the national press, the city negotiated with the activists and the civil rights leaders and changed a number of the policies. Now, the thing about changing policies is it doesn't always change the hearts and minds of some of the terrorists who are against those kinds of changes. And so in May, so then later on in September 1963, the KKK planted a bomb in the church, 19 sticks of dynamite, and it blew up on a Sunday morning, killing 4 little girls and injuring many, many others. Now, this was in the context of all kinds of movements for racial justice. You got to remember there was the Montgomery bus boycott had occurred in 1955 and 1956. Shortly after this event, there was the assassination of President Kennedy, and then the passage under President Lyndon Johnson of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a seminal event and prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Today, we're going to talk about the prosecutions, some of the inside stories, and some of the significance of these prosecutions and this event nationally and in Alabama. So welcome to both of you, Bill and Doug. Thank you so much for being on this show.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for inviting us, David.
Okay. Bill, I'd like to start with you and talk to us about how you got involved in this. The FBI had investigated this from 1963 to 1968, and they closed their case file without initiating a single prosecution. How was it that you decided to prosecute these men or Mr. Chambliss when you became state's attorney general?
Well, David, 63 was a very significant year in our country's history, really, but certainly in the civil rights movement. Earlier in 63, Mississippi's leader in the movement, a black man by the name of Medgar Evers, was assassinated by another Klansman when he came in late at night to his home, drove in his carport, and was shot in the back of his head, or in the back as he was getting out of his car and going inside. Then a little later on, was in June, first week of June, was the famous or infamous stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, where Governor Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door, but stood aside when Nick Katzenbach and the Alabama National Guard was federalized by President Kennedy, and the two students were admitted. A little later on that year, in August, all this in the same year, was the March on Washington, a very famous march where Dr. King made the great "I Have a Dream" speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. But then only a few weeks after that great speech, September 15th of 63, this bomb went off, and the 4 little girls were killed on Sunday morning while in a house of worship. I was beginning my senior year of law school. And I remember vividly where I was. The news came out. There'd been another bombing in Birmingham. I went to watch. They said it was a church. It was some injuries. And then a little while later, there'd been deaths. And it came out there'd been 4 little children. One of them 11 years old, the other 3 14 years old, that died, and others injured. And that really affected me. All the events of that year before it affected me. And but that one, to me, was the worst, most vicious of all the bad things that had happened. And I'd lost my appetite, couldn't eat. But that evening, I kind of made a vow to myself that I really wanted to get more active in trying to do something to change what had happened, especially about that case. Now, you got to understand what I envisioned at the time I would be able to do is maybe if they made a case, come volunteer to run errands for the FBI, the prosecutors. It'd have to be a federal case. I knew the state and the local people wouldn't do it. And but I wanted to volunteer and do that, help write briefs or whatever they wanted me to do. If it meant hot dog bringing or Coke bringing or donuts or cigarettes or whatever, I wanted to do it. But that didn't occur because they never brought a case. So I finished law school, and I reckon a stroke of luck or being in the right place at the right time and help of a lot of good friends. A little over 6 years after I made that vow, I got elected Attorney General of Alabama when I was 28 years old. And the Attorney General of Alabama has immense power as far as prosecutions go. So I knew that that night before I got sworn in, they were going over a badge and other kind of accoutrements, I suppose. I don't know how to pronounce it, but of office. And they had me a little card of how you could use the phone system of the state. That was before we had watch lines. And so I sat down when I got by myself and took that card out. I knew I'd be using it most every day. And I wrote those little girls' names. I remembered what I had vowed to myself that I'd made. I wanted to do something. And I said, well, you're now getting ready to go into maybe the only position in the world where you can do something. And that's bring up that prosecution again, try to find out who did it and bring them to justice. And so I wrote those little girls' names down, one in each corner on the back of that card. And sure enough, I started the investigation, and eventually we got the ringleader, whose name was Robert Chambliss, nickname that he gloried in, Dynamite Bob. And you mentioned earlier that there were a lot of bombings in the Birmingham area, and they were. But most of them were done by this same group that I prosecuted Chambliss in, and then 20-something years later, Doug got 2 of the others. The only reason Doug didn't get the 4th was he had died before we had the chance to prosecute him. So 3 of the 4 we eventually tried and convicted, and they all 3 died in Alabama prisons for that bombing case.
And that's great. And I understand you got some blowback when you first brought the prosecutions bill that a doctor who claimed, a chiropractor who claimed to be the head of the Ku Klux Klan, sent you a letter telling you to cease and desist. And you sent him back a letter on the Alabama State Attorney General letterhead that said, "Dear doctor," in quotes, "kiss my ass." Did you do that, sir? And was your mother upset with you?
Well, I was afraid she would be. I never thought it would get any publicity, but the Klan put it out. They wanted to put it out. They thought it would hurt me, and so they published it everywhere. And it turned out to be probably the most popular letter I know it was the most popular letter I ever wrote, but my mother never said anything bad to me about it. I got quite a few threats. Now we didn't publicize our investigation, and it didn't come out in the open for maybe 4 years, 3 years anyway, after we started. But when we started subpoenaing people, it leaked out, and that's when we started getting all the mail, including threats and things like that. And so this one demanded a reply, and so I gave him that as a reply.
Well, I think it was a terrific reply. Let me ask you, Bill, in your prosecutions, finding witnesses to come forward was, I'm sure, very difficult, but both because it was a cold case that had not been prosecuted by the U.S. attorney or the FBI. How did you go about getting witnesses? And were there any seminal or turning points when you got critical witnesses to come forward?
Well, it was difficult, and some of them we never did were able to put on the stand because it was too dangerous for them. We got a lot of information from the wives of the Klansmen. Most of those Klansmen that did those bad things were also very vicious people to their own families, and so quite a few of the wives of the Klansmen would give us, information, but they couldn't agree to testify. It would be a death warrant for them to testify, to let it be known they were working with us. So we never were able to use all of the people that we had given us information. But the one that jumps out at me, it was not a Klansman's wife, though. It was a black lady from Detroit, Michigan, that was down and visiting Birmingham the night of the bombing. And her name was Miss Curtis Glenn. Never will forget her. She had, even in the initial report to the FBI, and we found this in the Birmingham police files, she was visiting some people that lived right behind the church. And they stayed up late, and it was hot September 15th that night. And they were sitting out on their porch, which was right behind the alley, behind the church. And about 1 o'clock, almost 2 o'clock in the morning, they were out there, and it was dark. Nobody could tell they were out there. And this car pulled into the alley right in front of where they were sitting on the porch. And 4 white men were in the car, and 2 of them got out and carried something around. She saw it and carried something around the corner of the church, and weren't gone long. They got back in. When they opened the doors, the lights came on, and she got a good view of the front seat passenger, which she later picked out the pictures of from a great number of pictures laid out in front of her as Bob Chambliss. And she also wrote a great description of the car and the tag number, and described it to a T, and it was Tommy Blanton's car. And so we found that that scrap, and started tracking her down. It took years, and my investigators had trouble finding her, and I kept saying, how can you not find her? And so sure enough, they finally found her. And she was
she willing to testify?
No, that's the point of the story. She was in Detroit. And so they went to see her, and they came back to report to me and said that she was a really great person, and the jury, if she ever could testify, would love her and believe her because she was telling the truth, and she would be a super witness. And they told me that was the good news, but they had some bad news. I said, well, what can be bad with all that stuff? And he said, well, she won't come back to Alabama. And I said, why? She said she's never coming back to Alabama under any circumstances. I said, well, go back up there and tell her so and so and so and so. And I said, we told her all that. I said, go back and tell her again. They went back, came back, and said, she said she is not going to Alabama. So I think that happened twice. And I said, well, if I got to do everything myself, I'll go show you what you should do. So I went up there, and I thought I could talk her into coming. And back then, we couldn't make out-of-state witnesses come. I left that point out. Now you can. We got reciprocal subpoena power among the states. But back then, you couldn't make them if they were out of state. And so we went up there and I started talking to her and talked till I was blue in the face. And she wouldn't. She said, "Mr. Baxley, you're obviously a nice man. All these people that have been up here from your office are nice men. I hate to make them have made these trips, but I've told them from the beginning, I am not coming back to Alabama. I wouldn't even fly over Alabama in an airplane. I wouldn't even allow, if I got deceased somewhere and my remains had to be sent back to Detroit for a funeral, I wouldn't let it go through or over Alabama. I said, I'm not going to Alabama." And so I was just disheartened and got up to have some, she put out some little goodies for us, and I noticed a Jet magazine, and it was a kind of a special edition about the Montgomery bus boycott, and I picked it up, and there was a picture. It fell open to a page with a picture of Dr. King with his lawyer, who was a friend of mine, great lawyer in Alabama named Fred Gray. And on the other side of that page was Miss Rosa Parks, who had been arrested for the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was representing her also, as well as Dr. King. And so he was pictured with Rosa Parks. So I carried that book over there to Miss Parks. I mean, the witness, and showed it to her. And I said, "Look, if this lawyer right here, who Dr. King trusted at the beginning of the movement, and Miss Parks trusted with her life or future, if he would have come up here and tell you you needed to come back, would you do that after somebody that represented people like that they trusted and helped give birth to the entire civil rights movement?" And she said, "Well, I'd consider it." So I told my folks, "Let's get out of here." So we went out. I stopped at the first payphone. We had payphones back then. And I called and got Fred Gray, explained it to him, asked him if he could come up there. He said, agreed to drop everything, come up there. And we were up in the state plane. So I sent the plane back to pick him up. And we stayed, and the next morning went back over there. And so Fred came in. I introduced him to Ms. Glenn. And I said, "No, Ms. Glenn, you need to talk to Fred," to Mr. Gray, Attorney Gray. And she got out that book and turned it to those 2 pages. And thank goodness Fred didn't age much, but he still looked fairly young. She held that book up by his head and looked at the picture and looked at his head and looked at the picture and looked at his head, and finally said, "Okay, I'll talk to you." So Fred talked to her, and she agreed after hearing Fred, and he asked her to come back to Alabama, and she was one of the 2 great witnesses that we had.
Well, and that is just a fantastic story and an inside story about how you were able to get this successful prosecution, and you did put Bobby Chambliss away. And thank you for doing that, Bill. I'm going to turn now to Doug and talk a little bit about Doug's prosecution. So Bill prosecuted Bobby Chambliss, but that still left 3 other men. And Doug, can you talk a little bit about what was your original involvement in the prosecutions, and how did you come to prosecute the other 2 Klansmen who were still alive?
Well, David, I guess my original involvement, if you could call it involvement, was just simply as a spectator. I was only 9 when the bomb exploded, so I wasn't involved in the movement at all. But as a law student, I was in law school when Bill prosecuted the case he was just talking about. Found it incredible. Found it, in fact, I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And so I knew that if I wanted to be a trial lawyer, I had to go watch good trial lawyers, do what they do best, and that's trial lawsuits. And this was the biggest one we had seen in for a while. And so as a law student, a second-year law student, I cut classes and went and watched Bill try that case. Just an amazing case to watch. I can remember it like it was yesterday, and watching his closing argument. But I never dreamed that 24 years later, I would be the U.S. attorney and be in a position to be able to finish that job where Bill had started, and do it in the same courtroom. And one thing that I often get way too much credit, David, for those cases, in the sense that people think I reopened the case. I actually didn't reopen the cases. They were open when I became U.S. attorney in September of 1997. I just took it upon myself to take control. U.S. attorneys don't always get an opportunity to try cases. I had been a trial lawyer. I wanted to try this one. I'd also got to know the families, at least the McNair family, over the years. Chris McNair, the father of one of these girls that died, was a good friend. And so, I just made it a point of making sure that we really pulled everything into it, because at the end of the day, so many people think that the FBI didn't adequately investigate the case. They actually did, but because of J. Edgar Hoover's reputation, they thought that they didn't investigate it the way they should have. They did, but I told the staff that it was time that we took another look at it. By the time I became U.S. Attorney, we had seen several other cases prosecuted. The Medgar Evers case that Bill talked about a few moments ago was prosecuted successfully over in Mississippi in 1994. The Vernon Dahmer murder was prosecuted successfully. And so I think a whole new generation of prosecutors and investigators were taking a look at these cases and said, it's just never too late for justice, and we can do the right thing. And so we also knew the stain that bombing left on our city, on our state, and really on this country. And we felt like that we had an opportunity to finally reach back and do the right thing, to seek that truth and to seek that justice. And we had a great team that put it together.
Were you able to prosecute it as the U.S. Attorney, or were there some special circumstances that you had to jump through in order to prosecute these cases?
Yeah, it's a good question. We investigated this case out of the U.S. Attorney's office. We had incredible support from my boss, who was then Attorney General Janet Reno. But we also knew that we may not have the federal jurisdiction to bring that in federal court. And so we also had the state of Alabama involved in our local DA's office. At the end of the day, we didn't have that jurisdiction. A lot of people don't realize this, but even when in the 1960s and 70s and really through the 80s, the statute of limitations for a civil rights death was only 5 years. It was the same as any other violation. And so the federal statute of limitations had run on just about everything except interstate transportation of dynamite when the death occurred. But we couldn't make that. We couldn't actually prove that it was dynamite. Most people think that it was consistent with that, but we couldn't prove it. And so we ended up moving the case over to state court. They had been a partner the whole time. The Alabama Attorney General then, Bill Pryor, who is now the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, designated me and one of my assistants as Special Deputy Attorneys General. And we actually prosecuted the cases over in state court. And that's, there is some justice in that itself, because I've always believed that the style of these cases should have always been the state of Alabama versus Tommy Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry, because it was the state in the 1960s, not until Bill came along in the 1970s, that the state of Alabama did the right thing in these cases. And so I'm really glad we ended up prosecuting them over in state court.
So, Doug, what were some of the most significant moments to you in the prosecution of Blanton and Cherry as a trial lawyer?
Yeah, we had a couple of things during the investigation that proved to be fruitful for our trials. One of the early things that happened, and I had not even become U.S. Attorney yet. I was just about a month out before I became U.S. Attorney. And the investigators went out to try to interview Bobby Frank Cherry, one of the targets, who was living in Maybank, Texas at the time. And afterwards, he didn't admit anything, although he admitted enough things that we were able to use some of it in the courtroom. But what he did was call a press conference and denounce the FBI and the Attorney General and everybody else. And when he did that, our phone started ringing. And one of the first people that called was his granddaughter, who said, "Thank God you're looking at this. Everybody knows my grandfather was involved in these crimes. He used to brag about it at Sunday dinners." We had about 3 other people called that over the years, Bobby Frank Cherry had gotten very, very complacent. It felt like he had gotten away with it and started bragging about it to family and friends. And so that media prompted about 4 or 5 people to come forward with Bobby Frank Cherry admissions over the years. And so the other really significant thing that occurred, and we used this in trial, in the Blanton case, we knew that in the 1960s, there were a lot of wiretaps, there were a lot of bugs, electronic surveillance of some of these folks, but we literally could not find a lot of the tape recording. And my investigator, Bill Fleming, who was an FBI agent at the time, great guy, great investigator, was just dogging and trying to find these tape recordings of these guys. And lo and behold, after we had indicted the cases and were in discovery, Bill, in a back corner of the evidence room in a cardboard box, found a whole series of tape recordings, and one of which was a bug in Tommy Blanton's house. And in that recording, he admits in a conversation with his wife, Jean, who he had been dating at the weekend of the bombing, and another person that we still haven't identified. He admits that when she asked him about what he was doing that weekend, he admits he was part of the group that was planning the bomb, making the bomb. And we were able, through some really great lawyering that I don't take credit for, got that tape into evidence. And out of his own admission, mouth, admission 3 times of being part of the bombing was just really damning to him. And those were some of the most incredible moments of the trial. And I think we culminated our trial in one of the most dramatic moments, I think, in the history of criminal justice in this country. And that is with a piece of history about this bombing that people forget. And that's that there were 5 little girls that morning in that ladies' lounge. And the 5th little girl didn't die. She lived, and it was Sarah Collins Rudolph. And she walked over to the sink in the ladies' lounge to wash her hands and looked around, and I asked her, what was it that she saw? And she said, I saw my sister tying the sash of Denise McNair's new dress. Her sister was Addie Mae Collins. And then there was the explosion, and she was buried under all this rubble. I put up a picture of her in the hospital, this frail little black child with 2 large white patches over both eyes. She's still blind in one eye. And I asked her if she ever heard from her. What did she do? She said, I yelled up for my sister, Addie, Addie, Addie. And said, did you ever hear her again? No, sir. Did you ever see her alive again? No, sir. And we rested our case. And I got to tell you, David, you're an old trial lawyer yourself, and Bill will tell you, you don't get many moments like that when you're with a jury. But that was truly one of the most dramatic moments. And I felt like at that point that we had our jury.
Yeah, well, you did a great job. What were some of the hurdles and some of the difficulties that you had in prosecuting the case?
Well, my case, Bill tried his case like 13, 14 years after the fact. Mine was 37 and 38 years after the fact. So you can imagine trying to track down witnesses, trying to determine if witnesses were still alive. That was number one of the biggest hurdle. And then when you did find witnesses, trying to talk to them to get them to remember things, trying to get them opened up. We didn't get a lot of cooperation from any of the Klansmen. We had grand jury work. We had all manner of things that we really worked on the Klansmen. We worked on their wives. We didn't get a lot of help. We did have one informant who was an informant at the time that made some recordings as well. He was our best Klansman as a witness. But that time, and to show you, David, what I mean by the fact that time was just not on our side. When I became U.S. attorney, and they said, don't get your hopes up about this case, Doug. I said to my staff at the time, if we don't do this now, it'll never get done. And I really didn't realize how prophetic it might have been, because literally after our trial, there was one critical witness in the Blanton case who had seen Blanton and Chambliss outside the church by the steps where the bomb had been planted, had seen them at 1 o'clock in the morning the night before. He had a stroke, and then he died within 30 days after our conviction of Blanton. He had the stroke ahead of time, and we had him come in. We actually ended up having to read his testimony. But then after the Cherry case, which was a year later, we just had one witness after another. It seemed like every month there was another witness who had testified in that trial that passed away. I mean, it literally, including the mother of one of the children, the informant I was talking about a few moments ago, the pastor of the church, an FBI agent who was the one who made the tape recording that we played. And I mean, it literally, and I've said this, and for those people of faith, it was literally as if God kept them on earth to finish that job. It was just really remarkable that we were able to complete that matter before all of those witnesses passed away.
Well, without your perseverance and commitment to initiating the opening or the reopening and the re-prosecution of these perpetrators, that would never have happened. So the timing was fortuitous for you. So thank you so much for doing that. You know, I'm going to turn back to Bill because I thought there was one story. Bill, Doug just talked about this closing argument that he made with Addie McNair. I mean, the sister of Addie. And tell us about when you did your closing argument. Was there any seminal moments that you had in bringing home to the jury just why this case should have been prosecuted and why the Chambliss should have been convicted?
Yeah, there were a couple, but before we do that, if I could, something right now I want to add to what Doug was saying. And some people might wonder what happened between in the 20-something years after I tried Chambliss before Doug got to do his trials. The biggest regret I ever had with my public service was that I left office and only had a chance to try Chambliss. We didn't have the evidence on the others that we had with Chambliss. And I decided not to indict anybody but Chambliss because I didn't want a bad case to go to trial first and then get acquitted. So then I went out of office, and the people that came in after me didn't do anything. They thought it was unpopular, which I reckon it was. And so nobody did anything. And I really regretted, and I want to say lost sleep occasionally, not for 20 years, but worrying that I didn't finish the job I wanted to. And there were still people that were guilty, 2 of them anyway, were still alive, and they were out walking around. And I didn't realize that young law student, Doug Jones, had been sitting up there in that balcony watching that case. And so 20-something years later, Doug comes in and he picks it back up when nobody had done anything for 20-something years. And Doug finishes the job that I couldn't finish and gets the other 2 convicted, and all 3 of them died in an Alabama prison. And Doug will always be one of my heroes for picking that up. But now I'll tell you the answer to your question. I have to pick 2 or 3 things, but now I also used the sister as one of my last witnesses too. But that's not the significant part of my closing statement, I don't think. When I came back to make my closing statement, it was right after lunch, and one of my assistants named John Young that had helped me try the case and had worked on the investigation big time. When I walked in, he said, "Baxley, come here, I want to show you something." I said, "Oh, I'm busy, Young. I'm trying to get my argument." He said, "Come here." I said, he said, "Baxley, come up here. Let me show you this." So I went up there, and he said, "Look at this." And he handed me State's Exhibit number 1. And I said, "Okay, it's the death certificate for Denise McNair." And it was Denise's case. I also broke up the cases into 4 separate cases, 1 for each girl, and we only tried Denise's case. And so I said, "Okay, so what's the death certificate for Denise?" "What?" He said, "Baxley, you dummy, look at the date of birth." And the date of birth for Denise McNair was that day. And so that was her birthday. So I was able to close my argument by saying, I want you to look at State's Exhibit number 1 and look at this date. And I held it up and walked up in front of the jury with it. And I said, whatever date that was, I read it. And I said, tonight in the McNair house, there ought to be joy and celebration, maybe a birthday party, a cake, ice cream, maybe grandchildren over, maybe talking about a new job, maybe talking about school, celebrating Denise's birthday. I said, this day will never be celebrated in the McKnight house. It'll never be a happy day in the McKnight house. And there won't be any talks about Denise's children or jobs or school or anything like that. But I said, but you people will have an opportunity to do something that no other people on this planet will ever be able to do. You can give Denise McNair a birthday present that I believe with all my heart she will know about. You can finally bring her killer to justice. And I sat down. And I didn't even know about that thing until I walked in and my assistant pointed it out to me, just fell in my lap. But that, to me, was the big thing about the final argument that was made it special.
So, Doug, I'd like to change tacks here and talk a little bit about the meaning and significance and relevance of the prosecutions and in our world today. What first off, what is your thought about the meaning and the significance of the prosecutions that you and Bill pursued, and how you think that affected race relations both nationally and in Birmingham and in Alabama? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, David. Thanks for asking that, because I do think that they had a significant effect. People for the longest, and to some extent, people still do. They see Birmingham in black and white images of fire hoses and the dogs. But I think after these cases, Birmingham can be seen as a city of living color and welcoming. Now, Bill's, I think, had a little bit different effect because we were coming right off of the civil rights movement. But by the time Bill did his cases, Birmingham was an all-American city. We were moving in a different direction. Chris McNair, the father of one of these kids, had become a state legislator. So Bill's case was able to demonstrate that to the country. But 24 years later, we were still making progress for sure. But at the same time, we have to continue to talk about these cases and bring this up, because I think, quite frankly, we're backsliding on civil rights. We see the same kind of divisive rhetoric and what I call the dog whistle rhetoric that causes a lot of racial violence across the country. And I think we have to continue to bring these cases to the forefront, talk about them. We've got the 60th anniversary of this bombing occurring this September. And I hope we use that opportunity to remind people where we were in this country as a whole, in which 4 young children would die just because of the color of their skin. We're still seeing kids, especially young black males, dying because of the color of their skin. And we need to continue to talk about these cases to try to move forward and not backwards.
Right. It's super important. And Bill, what are your thoughts on the effect that your successful prosecution of Chambliss had in the community back when you did it, and your thoughts about how Doug's prosecutions have also affected the mindset, the hearts and minds of people?
I got a little bit different perspective than what Doug does. I don't think that it changed a lot of minds, and it wasn't that popular about bringing people together. But I think that the most important part of our conviction was that it sent a message for the first time, really in the South, not just in Alabama, to the Klan, that they were their murderous activities and lawless activity and threatening people was not going to be tolerated. And our jury, I think, was 10-2 white. It could have been 9-3, but it was vast majority white. And so when Chambliss, who was the ringleader of nearly all those bombings, when he got convicted, and then we followed that up shortly after with convicting another bomber named J.B. Stoner out of the Atlanta area that was the most anti-Semitic man in the history of the country, in my opinion. But we convicted him of a 1957 bombing of Reverend Shuttlesworth Church. We indicted him before Chambliss, I think, but it took him a long time to get him extradited. But it sent a message and it also sent a message to some of the other, law enforcement departments where you had good people and prosecutors around in Mississippi and Alabama and elsewhere. And they started then looking at some other cases. It took a while, but I think the main thing was the message it sent to the Klan that their lawlessness was not going to be overlooked by legitimate law enforcement, and they were going to go to prison.
Right, and that was a very
David. Can I follow up on something like that? Because I totally agree with Bill about the message it sent. And in fact, in my argument, in my statement, in my cases, I reference this to terrorism and the fact that we'll go to any lengths to try to to prosecute people afterwards. The difference, I think, though, there's a big difference between the public reaction after Bill's case and my cases. If there is a downside, and there is one major downside to Bill having successfully prosecuted these cases, and that is the fact that I am convinced it cost him the election as governor in 1978. And I really believe, and had Alabama elected him governor, we would have been a far different place for a long time. But it cost him that. You contrast that, though, that after mine, I think it helped me across when I ran for the United States Senate in 2017. We didn't run away from this. We wore it as a badge of honor. And I think at that point, people celebrated it a little bit. So the differences in those 24 years, I think, made a huge difference with a whole new generation of people that saw these convictions in a different light. And I can tell you right now, as I've gone around this state, if Bill Baxley wanted to run for governor today, he could get elected because of that, because of those cases and that what he did in 1977.
Well, Bill, you have my vote. Although I think it'd be illegal for me to try and vote in Alabama. But that's very interesting. So let me ask you this. Let's just start with you, Doug, and then go to Bill. So, since the prosecutions, I mean, there have been a lot of changes, both positive and negative over the last 20 years. I mean, we've had many positive changes. We've had the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement and the successful prosecutions of the killer of George Floyd and the killer of Trayvon Martin for just being Black and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But at the same time, there have been many negative developments. The rise of the far right as the base of the Republican Party, the conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court that has rolled back critical sections of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So how do you think these new developments have occurred and affected kind of what's going on here in light of your own experience with these prosecutions and what you think the future holds here for race relations and the relevance of the bombings and the prosecutions? Doug, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, David, I think, as I said a moment ago, I fear that we have taken some steps back. We have still made incredible progress over the years. You could just have to look around at every state, including Alabama. But the fact is, between the civil rights rolling back to protections of the Voting Rights Act, between the way that some politicians still use race to divide us, we've taken a few steps backward as well, and we see more hate crimes. The interesting thing about hate crimes now, it's not just black and white. It's more anti-Semitic hate crimes. It is a number of things where immigrants are subject to this. So we've become a more diverse society, and we're going to continue to be a more diverse society. And as we do that, that is a threat to some people, and they will lash out and they'll lash back. And what we've got to do, I think, is have more dialogues than monologues. And we got to talk to people about the fact that everybody, this is a land of, or should be a land of equal opportunity. And equal opportunity helps everyone. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are. And I think we need to have more of those. And I think we need to teach our kids that. I think social media has driven people apart a lot. You can go to any number of hate websites these days. What you see on the often on Twitter and Facebook now and others, it's some really bad stuff out there. And we're going to have to make a conscious effort to make sure that we continue to do what, to do what Dr. King said, and understand that we are all part of this together. We're caught in that web of mutuality that he talked about, and work together. I'm still very hopeful, but we've still got a few rough waters, and I think it's going to take some politicians to have a little courage to stand up and not just talk the talk, but really walk the walk about racial equality and protections and equal opportunities.
Right. And Bill, what are your thoughts on the future of race relations and social justice here? In the aftermath of the bombing, the prosecutions, and then some of the changes in society that have occurred here in the last 15, 20 years.
Well, David, they're mixed. I agree with Doug. It was his prosecution was popular. Mine was not. But I knew, I understood politics. I didn't get elected at 28 to a major state office and beat an incumbent without understanding politics. I knew that it was going to be unpopular when I did it. I thought that'd be a small price to pay. It might cost me winning elections, but it'd be a small price to pay if you convict these people that did that horrible crime and bring some sense of justice to the relatives of those little girls and those little girls' memories. And so I was willing to pay that price. But having said that, I was more optimistic that we were going to solve things and move on to a better life for everybody, more equal opportunity back then than I am now. Now, I do not think we'll ever again get to where violence is tolerated by extreme right-wing or extreme left-wing elements. I think society will come together to stop that. So I think that I don't think we're going to have any. Well, for one thing, we don't have Klansmen in law enforcement anywhere now like we used to have, and we don't have law enforcement is not infiltrated by terrorists of either side. But back then, for instance, when the '64 Civil Rights Act passed and the '65 Voting Rights Act passed, a bigger percentage of Republican senators voted for it than the Democratic senators voted for it. And I think maybe a bigger percentage of not numbers, but bigger percentage of the Republican House members, I think, voted for it. I'm afraid we're not seeing that type nonpartisanship that we saw back then, at least in the Republican Party. The bad side was coming from the Democratic Party, the Southern Democrats back then. But I'm not as enthusiastic or optimistic about that changing anytime right away. I'm afraid I might not last long enough to see it change. It will change, but I want to see the party of Lincoln get back to the principles of Lincoln.
I want to bring up something that Bill, I'd like for you to consider something. You said that one of the differences that we don't have the Klan in law enforcement. We do. It's just not called the Klan. We've got so much white supremacy in law enforcement today that it's frightening. And there are studies that show that consistently. And that's why there is so much movement, I think, around for more training, because and not just more training, but also more screening to screen folks out. And I worry that you might get a fair amount of pushback from folks that remember George Floyd and remember Michael Brown and some of these others with that, because that is something that the Center for American Progress has been looking at and tracking. And it's not only a problem in law enforcement,
that's a
problem in the military.
I was thinking about these small police departments, and you did have active Klan members.
Oh yeah.
You have things the Klan stood for, that principles that too many is tolerated still in too many places in law enforcement. I agree with that.
Yeah, it's a real problem. It's a major problem right now. It's just not like the old days where the Birmingham police officers would literally go to the Klan meetings. They don't do that, but they're still there.
As we're wrapping up here, let me ask you, and I'll start with you, Bill. Well, what are your thoughts on, what any of us can do today? What activists, what people of good conscience can do to take the legacy and move forward, and both in Alabama and nationally? Do you have any thoughts on that? And then I'll ask the same question to Doug.
It's not glamorous, but my thoughts are to, first of all, learn what these people did throughout our history to make things better. Read about it, learn of the obstacles that they overcame, learn of what they did that at the time was unpopular and what steps they took. And then history repeats itself. Put the things they did, learn from it, build on it, and do the same type things. But you've got to know where you've been to get a good idea of where you need to go. And so I'd say learn what the people did even before the civil rights movement to get voting rights for females. When I started practicing law, women couldn't serve on the jury, whether they were white or black in Alabama. Some counties would allow black men to serve. Most counties did not, but the whole state had a law prohibiting females from serving when I was a young lawyer. So you learn, women couldn't vote before the First World War, and except I think in Nebraska.
We're glad those days are behind us somewhat. But Doug, how do you maintain hope given some of the backsliding? What are your thoughts on what activists and people of good conscience can do to move the ball forward, help bend the arc of history in a positive rather than negative direction?
Well, I think Bill hit it, and that is about history. And I think that's a challenge right now. I think we got to push back from all these folks who say, that are trying to ban books, that are trying to rewrite history and celebrate the lost cause of the Confederacy, and just write out the history of slavery, to write out the history of the civil rights movement and the sacrifices that were made. We've got to make sure that we don't ban those books, that we don't censor those books, that we teach and we celebrate what we've accomplished in this. But that's not to say that we just need to varnish over the flaws that our country has had, because we have them now. We're still going to have them. And the other thing, David, I think people have to go where people are. You have to understand where people are coming from a little bit, and just talk and have these discussions with them. And when you talk to somebody, it's more important that you listen to them a little bit and understand some things. And you may not agree with them all the time, but we need to try to find more common ground than I think is happening. We've become so politically polarized right now that we've got to try to figure out ways to bridge those gaps and try to come back together, that we can move forward a lot going forward, or else we're going to continue to this move toward authoritarianism, which is just really dangerous for this country. And I just don't like what I see, especially coming from the radical right. But the fact is, we can go there, we can talk, and we can move. The one thing I think everybody needs to remember is that this country is becoming more diverse every day. That is not going to change, and that we should celebrate that. We've always been destined to be a multicultural, multiracial country, and we need to celebrate that and work together to make it continue to be. And my hope is with the younger generation, because this younger generation sees it, they get it, and they want to make sure that they treat all their friends the same way, and that everybody else does as well.
Well, thank you, Doug. I know you did that in a bipartisan way as a U.S. Senator. I want to thank both of you for spending time with me today to talk about your roles in the civil rights movement and the successful prosecutions of the bombers of this heinous crime. So thank you so much. And, we'll look forward to seeing you folks again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.